I thought it was going to be a normal summer, a time to relax and let go of all the stresses that had piled up over the school year. But the moment I stepped into the house, something felt different. The air was thick with tension, the silence almost suffocating. The house felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I looked around, expecting to see the familiar comfort of my parents' home. Instead, the house felt strangely foreign, as though it had been altered in ways that only I could feel but couldn't explain. My brother, Alex, greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was acting strangely, more distant than usual, as if there was something he wasn't telling me. But I shrugged it off. He had always been the more introverted one, the quiet observer in the family. I figured he was just in one of his moods, and I didn't think much of it. The house was empty, just the two of us. Our parents were away on a weekend trip, leaving us to fend for ourselves. It should have been an easy few days, just me, Alex, and some time to kill. But there was something unsettling in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was like the walls themselves were whispering, urging me to pay attention. I tried to brush off the unease, but as the evening wore on, the oddities started piling up. A strange glance here, a brush of the hand there. At first, I convinced myself that it was all in my head, that I was just imagining things. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized that this wasn't just my imagination. There was something going on, something I wasn't prepared for. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to find out what it was. The house we grew up in had always been a sanctuary. It wasn't anything grand, just a small two-story home tucked away in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The creaky wooden floors, the old stone fireplace, and the faded wallpaper in the hallway, these things had always made it feel warm, like a place where everything was familiar and safe. Over the years, it had become a second home for me, a place to escape and recharge. But now, standing in the entryway, I felt a chill I couldn't explain. It wasn't the house itself that felt different, it was the absence of the usual warmth, the absence of the voices I was used to hearing. Our parents had left for the weekend, something about a quick getaway, leaving me and Alex to hold down the fort. I wasn't used to being alone with him for more than a few hours at a time. Our relationship had always been more distant than I'd like to admit. Alex was the quieter, more withdrawn sibling, and I was the one who often found solace in my friends rather than family. We'd spent our younger years playing together, but as we grew older, we seemed to drift in different directions, barely sharing the same space. As I kicked off my shoes and hung my jacket, I noticed the silence seemed even more profound than usual. There was no background noise, the hum of the fridge, the low murmur of the television, the sound of our parents moving about the house. Nothing. Just silence. Alex was sitting on the couch, his legs crossed, his gaze fixed on the screen of his phone. The flickering glow of the screen illuminated his face, but he didn't look up as I entered. He was always on his phone these days, buried in some app or game. I'd never been particularly close with him, but there was a time when we could at least talk about something without feeling like strangers. Now there was a distance that had grown between us, one I couldn't quite bridge, and it was beginning to feel like that gap was widening even further. I leaned against the doorframe, trying to get his attention. "Hey man," I said, my voice louder than I intended. "What's up with the quiet? You're usually blasting music or something." He didn't respond immediately, just tapped his phone a few more times before finally glancing up at me. His eyes seemed a little too bright, too focused. He smiled, but it wasn't the same easygoing grin I was used to. It felt rehearsed, strained, like he was putting on an act. "Not much," he muttered. "Just didn't feel like making noise." He shrugged, a move that was so uncharacteristic of him that I almost did a double take. Alex had always been the one to fill any silence with his presence, whether it was with a half-hearted joke or some random observation. Now, he was like a shell of himself, retreating into his own little world. I nodded, but the unease in my chest only deepened. The air seemed to grow thicker the longer I stood there. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the quiet playing tricks on me, but something felt off. I tried to distract myself with the house itself, looking around for any changes since our parents had left. But there was nothing new. The same dusty old portraits hung on the walls, the same worn carpet covered the living room floor. Everything was exactly as it had been for years. Yet, the house felt different. I tried to make small talk, asking Alex about his plans for the weekend, but he wasn't very talkative. He gave short, clipped answers, his gaze flickering back to his phone every few seconds. It was as if he was avoiding me, unwilling to engage in any real conversation. I tried to shrug it off, convincing myself that it was just his usual mood, but the silence between us grew heavier, pressing down on me with every passing minute. The clock on the wall ticked louder, its rhythmic sound cutting through the stillness. The walls felt like they were closing in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something I wasn't prepared for. But what? I made my way into the kitchen to fix myself a drink, hoping to break the silence with some noise. As I rummaged through the fridge, I couldn't help but glance back at Alex. He hadn't moved, still sitting in the same position on the couch, his eyes glued to the screen. His stillness made the air seem even more suffocating. The house, which had once been a comforting refuge, now felt like a place I was desperate to escape. But I didn't know where I could go, or if it was even the house itself that had changed. Maybe it was just me. Maybe it was just the strange, unspoken tension between Alex and me. Or maybe there was something more to this, something I was only beginning to sense but wasn't yet ready to face. As I poured myself a drink, I noticed that Alex was staring at me now, his gaze intense, unsettling in a way that made me stop mid-pour. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw something flicker in his eyes. Something dark, something I didn't understand. But when I looked again, his expression had returned to its usual blank stare. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. It was just my imagination. But the feeling lingered, clinging to me like a shadow that wouldn't let go. The first time I felt the weight of the tension was when I realized Alex wasn't just being quiet. It wasn't something as simple as a bad mood or just being distracted by his phone. It was deeper, something heavier, an unspoken shift in the atmosphere between us. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it was like the house had changed, grown quieter, darker, even though nothing had physically shifted. The air felt denser, as though it had absorbed some unsaid thing. I tried to ignore it. It was probably nothing, right? He was just being his usual distant self, and maybe I was reading into it too much. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. The house was too still. The rooms felt too empty. Even when I went to the kitchen for a drink, there was something unsettling about the way the silence echoed off the walls. The fridge buzzed softly, the sound stretching into a rhythm, like the house itself was holding its breath. When I returned to the living room, Alex was gone. The couch was empty, and the lights in the hallway were dimmed, casting long shadows across the walls. I called out to him, half expecting a response, but there was only the faint rustle of wind outside and the distant hum of a car on the road. The unease tightened in my chest as I walked through the house, calling his name a second time, louder this time. Still nothing. I passed by his room but didn't stop. His door was slightly ajar, and the light from inside flickered weakly, casting a strange glow on the hallway. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, a strange chill running down my spine. It wasn't just the quiet. It was the heaviness in the air, the sense that everything had changed and I was too slow to catch up. I took another step, then froze. There was a sound, a soft thud, like something shifting from the other side of the house. A door creaked. My breath hitched in my throat. What the hell was going on? Was Alex messing with me? Had he been hiding somewhere, trying to scare me? Or was I really imagining things? I found myself standing in the doorway of his room without realizing it. His bed was unmade, the sheets twisted in a disordered mess, but there was something more than just the mess. His phone was lying on the bed, face down. No sign of him. It was strange, disorienting. Alex didn't leave his phone out in the open like that, it was always attached to his hand. Then I heard it again, the creaking sound louder now. It came from the attic. I took a deep breath, my pulse quickening. It was probably just the house settling, right? Maybe the wind had shifted the roof or something. But somehow, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was up there waiting. Something or someone. Against every instinct I had, I found myself walking toward the stairs leading up to the attic. The house felt colder here, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet as I ascended. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, staring at the door to the attic, which was slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for me. The air felt thicker here, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have. It felt wrong. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. Alex. I called out softly, trying to sound calm, but it came out shakier than I intended. No response. Just the faint rustle of air moving through the cracks of the house. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges protesting in a low squeal. The attic was shrouded in darkness, save for the faint light of the moon creeping in through a small window near the roof. Dust particles floated lazily in the air, catching the dim light, giving everything an ethereal, otherworldly quality. The room was filled with old furniture, boxes of forgotten memories, and unused items that had been stored there for years. It was a mess of clutter, untouched and left behind. My breath caught in my throat when I saw him. Alex was standing in the far corner of the attic, facing away from me. His back was rigid, his shoulders tense. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence, as though he didn't even hear me. I called his name again, louder this time, but he didn't react. It was like I wasn't even there. I took a cautious step forward, my voice now shaking. Alex, what's going on? Why aren't you answering me? Still, he didn't respond. I took another step, and the floor creaked beneath my feet. Suddenly, Alex turned, and I froze. His eyes were wide, filled with an unsettling intensity. His face was pale, and there was a strange, almost unrecognizable expression on it. It wasn't fear, but something darker. Something unfamiliar. Alex. I whispered, but the sound caught in my throat. There was something in his gaze that stopped me from saying anything more. The silence between us grew thick, suffocating. I couldn't figure out what was happening, what was wrong with him. He stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate. There was a coldness in the air, as though the very atmosphere had shifted, and it was harder to breathe. You're not scared, are you? Alex's voice was low, the words coming out with a strange sharpness that I didn't recognize. It sounded like he was testing me, gauging my response. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands trembling. What do you mean? I finally managed to ask, though my voice was weak. His eyes locked onto mine, piercing through me like he was searching for something deep inside. I know you've been waiting for something. You don't have to hide it anymore. I took a step back, my mind racing. What was he talking about? Waiting for something? I wasn't hiding anything, I didn't even understand what he meant. But the look in his eyes, the way he held himself, made me want to back away further. There was something dangerous in that stare, something that wasn't Alex. This wasn't my brother anymore. I turned to leave, a wave of panic hitting me, but he grabbed my arm before I could take another step. His grip was firm, too firm. His fingers dug into my skin, sending a sharp pain through me. I froze, the air thick with tension. Let go of me, Alex, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, though it shook with fear. He didn't respond. His grip tightened. The panic was starting to flood my system, pushing at my chest. My breathing became shallow as my heart raced. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in on me. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but my body felt paralyzed. I'm not going to hurt you, Alex said, his voice a strange mix of calmness and something darker. I'm just trying to show you what's been happening. My mind raced to make sense of what he was saying, but nothing added up. Nothing made sense. My brother, the guy I had shared a childhood with, the guy I grew up with, was he really standing here holding me like this? What was happening to him? To us? I don't understand, I whispered, my voice trembling. You don't have to, Alex responded, his grip never loosening. Just trust me. That was when I knew. Something had changed. Something I wasn't ready for had just begun, and I had no idea where it would take me. The air in the house felt oppressive, as if it was holding its breath. Each moment seemed to stretch longer than the last, weighed down by an invisible force. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, the pounding rhythm a constant reminder of the danger that had slowly been creeping up on me for days. The hallway stretched out before me like a dark tunnel, and I could feel Alex's presence behind me, just beyond the threshold, watching me. I had tried to ignore the signs for as long as I could. The subtle changes in his demeanor, the way his eyes lingered a little too long on me, the way he'd begun to speak to me, differently in a way that made my skin crawl. But I couldn't ignore it any longer. Not when he appeared in the doorway, blocking my path, his silhouette casting a long dark shadow that seemed to swallow the room. Where are you going? His voice was cold, his tone too casual, like we were just having a normal conversation. But there was nothing normal about it. Not anymore. I froze, my mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't Alex, not the brother I had grown up with. There was something else inside him now, something that had taken root and was slowly consuming him, until there was nothing left of the person I knew. I was just going to the kitchen, I whispered, trying to sound calm, even though every fiber of my being was screaming for me to run. He stepped forward, closing the gap between us. Are you sure? His voice was low now, almost a whisper, but the weight behind it made the words feel like a command. Because I don't think that's where you were going. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I'm not sure what you mean, I stammered. The words didn't even sound like my own. Alex's eyes were too focused, too intent, like he was seeing right through me, to the very heart of me. And then, just as quickly as the tension had built, it shifted. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with something that made it harder to breathe. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, and my heart rate picked up again. Come with me, Alex said suddenly, his hand reaching out, as if to guide me. I backed away instinctively, my mind screaming for me to get away from him. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I knew enough to trust my instincts. He wasn't just my brother anymore. There was something darker, something far more dangerous lurking beneath the surface. And I had no idea how to stop it. No, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I don't know what you want from me, but I'm not going anywhere with you. His eyes flickered, something almost amused crossing his face, but it was gone too quickly for me to be sure. His hand didn't drop though, and that's when I realized, he wasn't going to let me go so easily. You don't have a choice, he said, his voice quiet but full of something I couldn't place. Something cold and final. Suddenly, everything went still. No noise. No movement. I could feel the pulse of my own blood in my ears, the pounding so loud it almost drowned out everything else. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even think. It was like the world had frozen around me, and all I could do was stand there, paralyzed by the intensity of the moment. Then, without warning, Alex stepped forward again, his hands still reaching for me. I felt his fingers brush my arm, cold and unfeeling, and it was as if my body was forced into motion by some unseen force. I didn't want to go with him, but my legs moved anyway, drawing me closer to him against my will. Stop! I yelled, my voice rising in panic as I pulled back, but it was no use. His grip tightened on my wrist, and the room around us seemed to pulse with something unnatural. He laughed, but it wasn't the laugh I remembered. It was hollow, empty, almost mechanical. You can't escape, he said. Not from me. Not from this. Terror gripped my chest, and I tried to wrench my arm free, but his strength was too much. My mind raced, frantic, searching for a way out, any way to break free from this nightmare. My heart was racing, every beat a drum of panic that reverberated through me, but I couldn't escape. Not now. Let me go, Alex. I shouted, but he didn't flinch. His eyes were unwavering, cold, and calculating. You don't understand, he said softly, his grip tightening even further. This is the only way. This is the only way we can both survive. The words hit me like a slap, and for a moment, I didn't understand what he was talking about. What survival? What was he saying? But then the room shifted again. The temperature dropped even further, and the lights flickered as though they were struggling to stay on. I could feel the walls closing in around me, the air becoming heavier, suffocating. And in that moment, it wasn't just Alex I was afraid of, it was everything. The house, the darkness that seemed to stretch out forever, the unspoken truth hanging in the air like a thick fog. Please, I whispered, the words coming out as a breathless plea. Please let me go. But Alex just stared at me, his eyes still burning with that strange, unfamiliar intensity. You should have listened when I told you, he murmured, as if he were speaking to himself. Now it's too late. Before I could react, everything erupted. The walls seemed to tremble, and the house groaned, as though it were alive and responding to the tension between us. Alex's grip on my wrist tightened, pulling me toward him with terrifying force. In that moment, I realized just how far gone he was. And just how deep I was now in this nightmare. The house itself felt like it was shifting, warping around us, and I couldn't escape it. I had to make a choice. The room was spinning, the pressure mounting, and I felt like I was being pulled in every direction at once. There was no easy answer. The house wasn't just a house anymore, it was a prison, and Alex wasn't just my brother. He was something else entirely. In a last-ditch effort to break free, I fought back, pushing against him with everything I had. But it wasn't enough. His grip didn't waver. And just as I thought I couldn't take anymore, Alex leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear. "You're mine now," he whispered, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed felt like a blur, a haze of confusion and raw, unrelenting emotions that I couldn't escape. The house was quiet, but the silence was oppressive. It wasn't the kind of quiet you could enjoy or find peace in. It was the kind of silence that screamed, that pressed against your chest and made it hard to breathe. Every corner of the house, every shadow in the hallway, reminded me of what had happened. Of what Alex had done. I couldn't look at him anymore. I couldn't even be in the same room as him without feeling like I was suffocating. It wasn't just the physical distance that separated us, it was something much deeper, something far more painful. The bond we had once shared, the closeness that had made him my brother, had been shattered in that one moment. He was no longer the person I had known, and the worst part was, I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know if it could be fixed. I spent the next few days locked in my room, avoiding him at all costs. I tried to block it all out, to pretend that nothing had changed, but the memory of his touch, the coldness in his eyes, haunted me. The worst part wasn't just the fear, it was the guilt. The guilt of feeling trapped. Of feeling like I couldn't do anything to change what had happened. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. I heard his words. "You're mine now." I couldn't get them out of my head. The finality in his voice, the certainty in his actions. It was like he had already planned it, already known how it would end. And I had no choice but to be swept along by it. It was a constant struggle within me. Part of me wanted to scream, to tell someone, anyone, what had happened. But the other part of me was terrified of what would happen if I did. Would they believe me? Would they think I was lying? The shame was overwhelming, choking me every time I thought about speaking out. It wasn't just the fear of what Alex might do, it was the fear of what the world would do to me. I found myself withdrawing even further, pulling away from everyone and everything. The guilt gnawed at me, eating away at my insides. I couldn't face anyone, not my friends, not even my parents. How could I tell them the truth? How could I explain what had happened? Alex didn't make it any easier. Every time we crossed paths, his eyes would lock onto mine, and I could feel the weight of his gaze, the way he watched me as if he was waiting for something. For me to break. For me to admit what had happened. I wasn't sure what he wanted from me, but I knew it wasn't anything good. He had taken control, and now it seemed like he was savoring the power he had over me. But it wasn't just him that kept me locked in this prison. It was the isolation. The way the walls felt like they were closing in around me, the way I couldn't trust anyone anymore. Every person I looked at felt like a potential threat, and the more I withdrew, the more I felt like I was suffocating. I would try to distract myself, to find something, anything, to take my mind off what had happened. But it was always there, lurking in the background, a constant reminder of my own powerlessness. I couldn't escape it. No matter how much I tried to push it away, the truth kept coming back, like a wave that refused to break. Some nights, I would lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to find a way to make sense of it all. Was I to blame for what had happened? Was there something I could have done differently? I would replay the events in my mind, over and over again, searching for an answer, a way out. But there was nothing. No easy solution. No way to fix what had been broken. And then there were the dreams. They weren't like regular dreams, the kind you forget when you wake up. These dreams stayed with me, clinging to me even after I opened my eyes. They were vivid, too real, too painful. I could still feel Alex's touch, still hear his voice, still feel the weight of his presence pressing against me. And when I woke up, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest, the real world seemed just as unbearable as the nightmares. The worst part was the fear that I would never be able to escape it. That I would be stuck in this endless cycle of guilt and terror, forever trapped in this house, forever haunted by what Alex had done. I couldn't go back to the way things were. I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. But I also couldn't tell anyone. I wasn't sure what would happen if I did. Would they believe me? Would they help me? Or would they just blame me, tell me it was my fault? I didn't know how to deal with the aftermath, how to make sense of everything. All I knew was that I felt completely alone. And every time I thought I had found a way to deal with it, to push the feelings away, Alex would appear, his eyes cold, calculating, reminding me that I was still under his control. It was like I was living in a never-ending nightmare, and no matter how much I tried to wake up, I couldn't. I thought I could forget it. That eventually, it would fade. But the reality was that it had become a part of me. A part of who I was now. A part that I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. The house felt different now. Empty, suffocating. And even though I was surrounded by people, I had never felt more alone. The weight of the past weeks had settled on my shoulders like an oppressive storm cloud. I tried to push it all away, but it lingered, a constant shadow I couldn't outrun. Every time I thought I had managed to put it behind me, something brought it all back. His face, those eyes, that haunting whisper. No one has to know. Alex was still there, still present, but his presence had changed. There was a certain calmness to him now, an unsettling kind of stillness that sent shivers down my spine. I hadn't spoken to him directly since that night, but it felt as though he was always watching, always waiting for the right moment to close in again. It had been almost 2 weeks since that night. 2 weeks of silence, of pretending that nothing had changed, when everything had. I had retreated into myself, trying to forget, trying to live my life as though it had never happened. But the truth was, it was inescapable. I couldn't go back to being the person I was before. I couldn't pretend anymore. The tension between us was unbearable. Every time I caught his gaze, my stomach twisted, and I had to look away. There was a heavy silence that hung in the air whenever we were in the same room, a silence that was almost too loud. And then, one evening, everything shifted. It was a Thursday night when the tension finally broke. I had gone to bed early, hoping to escape into sleep and leave the crushing weight of my thoughts behind. But sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, my mind racing, my heart thumping against my chest. Then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard a soft knock at my door. My pulse shot up, my heart leaping into my throat. It was too late for anyone to be coming in, and I knew exactly who it was. I froze. Should I answer? Should I pretend I was asleep and hope he would go away? But deep down, I knew that wasn't an option. I had been avoiding him for days, but the silence between us had grown unbearable. Reluctantly, I got out of bed and opened the door. There stood Alex, his face expressionless, his eyes intense as always. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low and calm, like nothing had happened between us. As though we were still the same people we had been before that night. I stood there, unable to speak, my throat tight with a mixture of fear and anger. What could he possibly want now? What more was there to say? His gaze didn't leave mine as he stepped closer, his presence filling the small room, making it feel even smaller. I could feel the heat radiating from him, and the air between us felt charged, electric. "You've been avoiding me," he continued, his tone deceptively casual. "You think I don't know? You think I don't see what you're doing?" I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The fear, the confusion, the guilt, they all fought for control over my mind. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him how much he had ruined everything. But there was no way I could. "You're afraid," he said, as if reading my thoughts. "But you don't need to be. I'm not going to hurt you. You just have to stop running. You can't run forever." I couldn't help but feel a chill creep down my spine. His words were too calm, too controlled, and they sent a wave of unease through me. It was as though he knew everything, as though he had figured me out completely. "I don't want to be like this," I finally said, my voice barely a whisper, a shaky tremor in my words. "I don't want any of this." Alex's eyes softened for a moment, and for the briefest second, it almost felt like the brother I used to know. But then his gaze hardened again, and the moment passed. "You don't get to decide what happens," he said, his voice lower now, more threatening. "You're mine now, and there's nothing you can do to change that." His words hit me like a slap. I wanted to push him away, to tell him to leave, but I was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to breathe. The fear that had been simmering under the surface suddenly exploded, engulfing me entirely. Alex took another step closer, his presence overwhelming. "I'll make you understand," he said softly. I know what you're afraid of. But I won't let you go. Not now. Not after everything. His words struck me deep, cutting into the core of who I was. The terror in me flared up again, but there was something else too, something darker, something I couldn't quite grasp. It was like I was drowning in a sea of emotions I couldn't understand, each one pulling me deeper under. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to escape. His hand reached out then, brushing lightly against my arm. The touch was gentle, but it burned like fire, sending shockwaves through my body. My mind screamed at me to push him away, to escape, but my body betrayed me. I won't let you go, he repeated, his voice a soft whisper now, almost tender. We're in this together. Whether you like it or not. Tears welled up in my eyes, and for a moment, I could hardly see him through the haze of my own panic. I wanted to fight. I wanted to scream. But there was something in his gaze, something that made it impossible for me to move. It was like he had power over me, a power I couldn't understand but couldn't escape either. Alex was no longer the brother I had known. He was something else now, something dangerous, something I feared with every fiber of my being. And just like that, I was trapped again. Trapped in his world, in his control, with no way out. The door clicked shut behind me, and I could still feel the weight of his touch on my arm, lingering like a burn that wouldn't fade. The air between us felt charged, as if every breath we took was laced with tension, and I couldn't escape it. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, heart hammering in my chest, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. Alex's words echoed in my mind, "You're mine now." His tone had been too calm, too assured, as if he truly believed that nothing could stop him. And in that moment, I wasn't sure he was wrong. I stared at the door, willing it to open and let me escape, but the silence on the other side was deafening. He hadn't left. No, I was sure he was still standing there, waiting for me to do something, anything. But what could I possibly do? I had no idea how to escape this, how to undo what had already been done. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, soft footsteps, too quiet to be anything but deliberate. My heart stopped in my chest. I turned around quickly, my breath catching in my throat, but when I looked, no one was there. The room was empty. Or so I thought. Before I could even react, I felt a hand on my shoulder, a firm grip that made my blood run cold. I gasped, spinning around to find Alex standing there, his face just inches from mine. His expression was unreadable, but there was a glimmer of something in his eyes, something predatory. "Thought you could escape me," he whispered, his voice low and dangerous. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot, caught in his gaze. His presence was overwhelming, suffocating, and I couldn't breathe. His grip tightened, pulling me closer, and I felt the heat of his body against mine. I wanted to push him away, to tell him to stop, but the words wouldn't come. The fear gripped me tighter than any physical hold could, and my mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Was there any way out of this? Was there any chance I could escape before things went even further? But even as I struggled to regain control of my thoughts, I felt something shift in Alex's eyes, a flicker of something new, something dangerous. His lips parted, and for a moment, I thought he might speak. But instead, he leaned in closer, and the tension between us reached a boiling point. Then, the door behind me creaked open. I whipped my head around, my heart leaping into my throat. Had someone heard? Had someone finally come to my rescue? But when I saw who stood in the doorway, my stomach dropped. It was Sam, Alex's best friend. For a moment, everything froze. The room, the air, the tension, all of it hung in suspended animation. Sam looked at me with wide, confused eyes, and then at Alex, who still hadn't released me. "What's going on here?" Sam's voice was tight, wary. But even in that single sentence, I could hear the undercurrent of something else. Was it suspicion? Or maybe something deeper? Alex didn't answer right away. His grip on me loosened, but only slightly, enough to make me feel a strange sense of hope before it vanished. His eyes flicked between me and Sam, as if calculating his next move. For a brief second, I thought he might let me go. But then, with a soft smile that didn't reach his eyes, Alex spoke again. "Just a family discussion," he said, his voice smooth and calm, but with a layer of something colder beneath it. Sam hesitated, uncertainty flashing across his face. "I didn't mean to interrupt." But before he could finish, Alex spoke again, his tone sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. "You haven't interrupted anything." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning, and I felt a chill run through me. It was as though the room had become a battleground. My mind, my emotions, and now Sam all trapped in the same space, tangled in this web that Alex had woven. Sam seemed to sense the tension, but he didn't push further. Instead, he stood there for a moment, silent, watching us closely. It was clear he could feel the shift in the air, the change in the dynamic between us. But did he understand? Did he know what was really going on? And just when I thought I might finally say something to break the silence, to clear the air, Alex stepped back, his grip completely releasing me now. "Get some rest," he said, as if nothing had happened, as if we were still the same people we'd been before all of this. But his eyes, those eyes that had haunted me since that first night, told a different story. He didn't look at Sam as he turned to leave. He didn't look at me either. But his last words echoed in my mind. "This isn't over." The door clicked shut behind him, and for a moment I stood there, unsure of what had just transpired. Was this really happening? Was I really trapped in this nightmare with no way out? Sam's voice broke through my thoughts. "What's going on, man? What's happening between you two?" I turned slowly, meeting his gaze. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. I didn't know what to say. Would he believe me if I told him? Could I ever tell anyone what was really going on? I didn't have answers. But one thing was certain. This wasn't over. And I had no idea how far Alex was willing to go. With that, the weight of the silence that filled the room was unbearable, and for the first time in weeks, I felt more trapped than ever.